¿Y ustedes quieren probar de qué estamos hechos? Pues creo que estamos en un magnífico sitio para saber de qué estamos hechos. Estamos hechos de esto, de lava, de volcanes. Estamos en el Geoparque Mundial de la UNESCO de Lanzarote y el archipiélago Chinijo. Esto que iba a ser un diálogo con la responsable técnica de este geoparque no va a ser posible. Elena Mateo la tenemos que disculpar porque está enferma, pero aquí tenemos al historiador Mario Ferrer, que nos va a hacer un recorrido por la historia de Lanzarote relacionada con los volcanes hasta llegar a la gran figura de César Manrique, que ha marcado un punto de inflexión en esta isla, en la isla de los volcanes. Así es como la llamamos. Dejamos para otro momento, para otro Volcanic, poder conocer más sobre ese patrimonio geológico que Elena nos tenía preparados para esta sesión, pero nos quedamos con la parte más histórica, más social que nos va a contar Mario. Pero antes,
historical and social comments that will be offered by Mario. We're going to have a little snack of some local sweets and also from chocolates from Arrecife. He's going to give us a hazelnut sweet, and this will be accompanied by a very special gin and tonic that will be presented by Roberto Acuña and Enrique Martín. So please come to the stage before we continue with Mario. Hello. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, one of the most amazing places on the island of Lanzarote, one of the most impressive temples created by César Manrique. I'm privileged to be here to introduce this sweet to you. It's actually a chocolate made of chocolate orange with a ganache inside. And to elaborate it a little bit further, we've topped it with some hazelnuts. Our project, La Corona, started with an accident. Here it was a work accident, not a volcanic accident. I wasn't able to continue with my previous career and I had to reinvent myself, something that we've all had to do on these islands, in particular Lanzarote. In my case, I reinvented myself as a sweet maker, and then I specialized in chocolates. So I really hope that you enjoy this specific chocolate that we've made for this event today. Thank you.
Ave del Paraíso Premium Gin.
Ave del Paraíso is the name of this premium gin that will be introduced now by Roberto Acuña. I'm going to take my mask off. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a little bit stuffy today in the nose, so I'll take my mask off so that you can hear me properly. Maybe it's best if you speak into this microphone. Yes. So first of all, thank you to the Lanzarote Island Council for having supported my project. And thank you to my colleagues who are always keeping me up to date with events like this. It's a little bit intimidating to stand on this stage today. It's actually the first time I've participated in a conference of this kind. My gin began as a hobby. Eventually it turned into a more serious project, and it is actually a family project in the town of Uga in the south. And we used to make wine for our own consumption. We went to visit a whiskey factory in Scotland. I don't really like whiskey, so I asked about gin. I went to a gin factory then in around 2014, 2015, and I learned how it's made. And this was really the beginning of everything. I started to teach myself, to watch online tutorials. I started with the most easy versions of gin, following videos on YouTube. I actually went to Scotland to specialize in this. As you perhaps know, juniper is the most important ingredient in gin. If something doesn't smell of juniper, then it's not to be considered gin. When I managed to distill juniper on my own, I started with other types of gin, experimenting with other plants. And I tried to specialize in particular with local varieties, always using juniper as the base ingredient, but combining it with other plants. For instance, this one, the Ave del Paraíso, it's the bird of paradise gin. This was actually something that I couldn't really include because it lacked the organoleptic properties that were necessary. But I kept the name. So I use lots of endemic plants to distill. There are lots of native varieties of plants. This one is made from cardamom, lemon as well. And I found that this mixture was the best. I managed to get about 13, 15 different products. And I started to share them with my friends. And gradually I contacted sommeliers so that they could help me. We selected 4 specific products. I've only actually started to manufacture and sell one of them so far, but I would like to start with another one quite soon. We won 5 international awards, actually, one in London. It's actually from a very well-respected, prestigious organization. And this really has helped me. It's been a stepping stone to reach a more international market. So I hope you enjoy this gin. I think you'll find that it's different to other types of gin that I'm sure you've tried. My goal is that you are able to identify this particular gin, the Ave del Paraíso, this product that was created right from scratch, rather than other products that are produced in factories, in multinational companies. Thank you. I hope you enjoy it.
Gracias, Roberto. Gracias a Enrique.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Enrique. I hope you enjoy this paradise gin. We really are actually in paradise right now at this lookout point, this Mirador del Rio, this river, let's say. It's this strip of water that separates Lanzarote from Graciosa Island, which is really worth a visit. It actually was declared the 8th Canary Island not so long ago. Now there are 8 of us and no longer 7. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to this art historian. He has a degree in journalism, and he's going to give us this historical and social background of Lanzarote. Well, good afternoon. The idea, of course, was to have a dialogue this afternoon with Elena. I'm not a scientist, I'm not specialized in geology, I come from a history background, but I'm going to try and speak now for around 20 minutes, not throwing lots of dates at you, but rather just giving an overview so that you're able to understand this landscape and this symbiosis between landscape and the people that live in this landscape. Would you mind putting the first photo up? Actually, it's a picture rather than a photo. So I guess in recent times, the most significant event was the eruption of Timanfaya. Just to give you a quick background, The Canary Islands, of course, had an Aboriginal population that came from North Africa. We're not sure exactly when, but it was probably around the turn of the century or the 1st century AD. These people from North Africa, they may have come, in fact, from lots of different tribes, lived in different islands. They lived in an isolated way until the Middle Ages. They didn't know how to sail. The Phoenicians and the Romans did know about the Canary Islands. They visited them occasionally. And after the arrival of the Europeans, the islands began to change a great deal. There was a renaissance. They reinvented themselves. French people from France, people from Spain as well, people from Normandy arrived in the 15th century. And during this period, there wasn't any volcanic activity in Lanzarote, but in 1730, suddenly, much like what's happening in La Palma right now, in September of that year, in the southwest part of the island, a volcano began to erupt. I hope that the same thing doesn't happen in La Palma, because this eruption involved more than 20 volcanoes over more than 6 years. So it had a huge impact. It affected most of all the wealthiest part of the island with the most agriculture. However, there is a curiosity. In the past, in Lanzarote, agriculture was based on dry farming, rain-fed farming, and so it mostly produced cereals. The larger islands, such as Tenerife and Gran Canaria, had another type of agriculture involving sugar and wine, which they were able to export to the UK and among other countries. And they, of course, capitalized on the strategic position of the Canary Islands to eventually export also to America. And so in the year 1730, the islanders fled. We don't know exactly how many people left, but we know that it affected around 20 of the wealthiest towns on the island. There have been studies carried out by many archaeologists, and we know that, of course, we can see from records that people had bought land and then 1 month later it was covered in lava. We're really not sure about the material cost of the destruction. It wasn't just the land, but it also destroyed a port, Puerto Real. It destroyed architecture. It was already, of course, an island that suffered a great deal from pirate attacks, from scarcity of water, etc. And so a large amount of the population, in fact, there was a royal decree to stop emigration at some point. The population of Fuerteventura, in fact, grew a great deal because of these people fleeing Lanzarote. Some of them arrived in Argentina, went as far as the Philippines. It also had a big effect on the mindset of the island. There was already very little rainfall, around 110 liters per cubic meter per year. There was a great deal of pirate attacks, as I said. So they feel almost like the cursed island. Although 10 or 15 years after this eruption, something curious began to happen. I'm sure most of you here recognize this landscape, but many tourists come, and the first time they see the land, they can't believe that we're able to grow things on black soil. Well, what happened was that this curse of the volcano ended up being a blessing. farmers realized, we're not sure who was the first to realize this or if there had been any previous incidents of this type of discovery in the past in other volcanic areas, but they realized that the lapilli, this fine volcanic stone, meant that they were able to water the plants more than they had ever been able to before. The fertile land was underneath, and the lapilli, which has lots of names here, depending on the island, was on top. So this lapilli then absorbed the humidity from the air, which was, of course, very scarce, and it kept it. It stopped the plant from drying out. Now, the volcanic eruption didn't distribute this lapilli uniformly throughout the whole island. It actually took centuries, it took generations of manual labor in quite an unjust feudal system, really, with large landowners who exploited the peasants, who were forced to spend from dusk till dawn distributing this lapilli throughout the island. Nowadays we have trucks to do this, but back then, or actually until very recently, there are videos still from the 50s and 60s that show how this was done with donkeys and on people's backs. So just imagine the effort involved with creating this landscape that we can see. This was actually a very sustainable development. Let's just imagine the destruction caused by this volcano. We can see it today in La Palma. It wasn't only land used to plant vineyards, but they also planted fruit trees. It's a very sustainable landscape. We have a bird protection zone in La Jeria. There are some very specific endangered species, but really it's quite an artificial landscape if you think about it. It's a man-made landscape. This wasn't what the volcano left behind. This was changed considerably. And when I talk about how special this landscape is, I always share this anecdote a friend told me about a winemaker from Catalonia. They came here on holiday to Lanzarote, and my friend, who's from here, has a disability. She's quite sensitive about these issues, and she saw, her son, has a disability, and she saw a child on the boat with a disability, with this winemaker who came from Catalonia. So they started talking, and this winemaker said that he had always been very impressed with the landscape in La Jeria because his family had a background of winemaking, but he had no idea that there was wine in Lanzarote. And it was just by chance that he was passing by La Jeria, this area, in his car, and he stopped and couldn't believe what he was seeing. He got closer and realized that they were vineyards. He thought instantly of his son and felt quite emotional, really, because of the beauty of what he was seeing. But also, when you think about it, it represents a great deal of suffering. These people that created this did it out of desperation, because otherwise they were faced with drought and potentially famine. Let's move from the 18th century then now to the 20th century. We're going to actually watch a short video now. Ines, would you mind putting it on the screen? This is actually a recording by Jembla Bauer, someone from Belgium. He's a photographer and a filmmaker, and it's the very first film in colour that we have of the island from 1954. You're going to see the island as it was before tourism arrived. This was the reality here until the 60s. It's an island that depends a great deal on fishing. Fishing in the Saharan coast, thousands of fishermen went there every year to try to make a living because it was so hard to actually make money from farming here, from agriculture. This is Arrecife. Right then it had 15,000 inhabitants and now more like 150,000. In fact, the airport, the runway wasn't tarmacked until the year 1965. So it was very hard to get here. This is the castle in Arrecife before Manrique's renovation. In the 60s then, there were plans to modernize the island. There was a search for economic alternatives to fishing and traditional sectors such as salt farming and agriculture. This was a pre-capitalist system here that suffered a great deal from a lack of water. So the José Ramírez in 1970, the president of the island at the time, realized that Spain was beginning to open up to tourism, to modernization, and he applied for help, for funding from the state. There was investment in transport, the airport, roads. At that time, Arrecife was practically the only town, and it started to gradually attract tourism. There was barely any private capital at this point yet. José Ramírez, the president of the Island Council, and other figures invited César Manrique, who at that time was living in Madrid. Actually, in the 60s, he lived in New York, and he had already done a bit of work on the island, and they chose him, they invited him to lead this modernization. There wasn't really a well-planned out program. They kind of made it up as they went along, and this was all happening in quite a strange context. These were the agricultural systems in the 50s. And agriculture workers talk about when they began to build this area here, the Mirador de Río. César Manrique, when he asked to work on these protected areas, the original reaction of the local government was that they should take all of the inhabitants of the island and put them somewhere else and actually just devote the island to soldiers, to military purposes. And César Manrique told this to the islanders. This was the original idea of the government because of the water scarcity and the damage caused by the volcanoes. By the year 1958, in fact, there was a water crisis and water began to be rationed. It had actually been brought by boat from Gran Canaria and Tenerife in times of drought, and it was rationed to 5 liters per day, per person. That had to last for eating, drinking, showering, cooking, washing, watering your plants, feeding your animals. Nowadays, we consume around 180 liters per person per day. And so it was impossible, given the circumstances, to plan this development. There was actually the first water purifier in Europe was built here. It was a real modern innovation, but it was absolutely vital for the modernization of the island. So I want to show you these images to explain why tourism was so important here in the beginning. It's a desert island. We have a black desert of the volcanoes. We have a white desert, a golden desert similar to the Sahara, which is all very close after all. The Sahara Desert is the biggest desert in the world, and we're right next to it. And we also have a blue desert because we're an island and because we lack water. And so the inhabitants at this time were always thinking about water, worried about water. I'll tell you now a more personal anecdote to do with my grandma. My grandma taught me something that all grandmas teach their grandchildren. This was in the 80s or 90s. Every time she washed the dishes, she saved the water to reuse it for the plants. And this was what everybody did. Society and culture here were of a people that were used to living in a desert until this huge change came in the 60s. These images are from the island of La Graciosa. You can see these black dots, this slight vegetation in the corner in the earlier images, but here there are none. These plants were called aulagas, and actually the little plants that grew were used, they burnt them to use them as fuel. So this was the situation when this idea came about to create these tourist centers. There was this realization that the island had something to offer tourists. It was, of course, an economic success, but also a cultural success. There was a change in the mentality of the islanders. Writers from the 19th and early 20th century all talk about the volcano as a sentence. This was a lifeless place, a sad place. But from the time of César Manrique onwards, there was this change in mindset, and islanders saw how people came from outside and admired the volcano as something good, something beautiful. It was a land of badlands. Yet, César Manrique was able to harness these landscapes. And it wasn't only César Manrique, scientists and other artists came. There was one German scientist that actually drew the volcano for the first time, and many other scientists came to actually research all of these abandoned landscapes, these badlands that had no interest to the locals, and they started to be given value. In the next image, we can see in the 50s, there were a series of key landmarks that became the key stop-off points for illustrious visitors that came to the island. One was right here, this lookout point, to see the northern islets and La Graciosa. Timanfaya was another one as well. So these particular spots in the island did attract these tourists, but they really weren't even particularly known by the local population and were certainly given no value. They began to use then these areas for having picnics. This is Jameos del Agua right here. Unfortunately, these places weren't very well cared for. People would leave their rubbish behind. They weren't protected. This happened in lots of places all over the Canary Islands, and gradually they started to deteriorate. And this is where the Island Council and César Manrique came in. And I'd like to finish by talking about César Manrique. He was a painter, a sculptor, designer, but he's given more to this island than just his art. He shared his mindset regarding culture and society in general, and he taught us a way of seeing the landscape and a way of envisaging tourism. His projects, such as where we are right now, well, we must bear in mind that the early paintings of César Manrique are always very connected with his homeland, with its orography and with its landscape. He was part of the avant-garde at the time, and so there's a clear influence from his homeland in his art even before he came back here to dedicate himself to these projects. There was always an effort to find a balance between natural landscape and the social use. There were a series of universal values of Manrique when it came to tourism. The idea was to give value to the culture of the place as much as the landscape. So, for instance, showcasing the pottery, the ceramics that are typical of the area. And everything he created tried to mimic the landscape around it, using these plants, these particular leafy plants. He was these ferns, he was a very holistic artist, and his work changed the mindset of the population. He was a passionate man who wanted to convince local people that their land was valuable. In the 60s and 70s then, as tourism started to arrive, and the things that were being showcased for the local people were signs of poverty, were negative things. And he wanted to make the locals feel proud of their traditions rather than ashamed. What he's left behind is a legacy, really, that still lasts today. Even in the 21st century, we're talking about his values, sustainability, respect for nature, discovering the values of each culture and the gastronomy of each place. All of these things are very obvious in his work. I hope that you're able to appreciate this in the visits that you're going to do the next few days to Dimanfaya, etc. You'll always see this link between humans and nature. That's everything from me, my summary of 3 centuries of the island's link to its volcanoes. And I hope you have some questions for me. Are there any questions? Yes. The interpreter can't hear the question. Okay, you're asking about projects in Fuerteventura. Okay. This is quite unusual project. He had a dream. We're talking about a mountain in Fuerteventura with lots of podomorphs, lots of archaeological records. I think that 4 or 5 million euros was spent on looking into the feasibility of this particular project that we're talking about. It's to do with the Tindaya mountain. Some people are in favor of the project being carried out, but certainly Manrique would not be in favor of this type of project being proposed. In the 60s, when, for instance, the Jameos del Agua began to be built in 1964, there was still no guaranteed fresh water supply, even in Arrecife. It was an experiment, really, to see what would happen. And tourism has changed very rapidly. In the 60s, there was very little. In the 70s, however, it rose a little bit, 150,000 tourists. And from the 1980s, however, visitor numbers rose a great deal. Ultimately, the heritage, the natural heritage, is a common good, and some people will always be in favor of change and others won't be. I think one of the interesting things of this photo is that this was a time when visitors started to arrive. In Timanfaya, for instance, cars were able to drive right over the lava, and here we have in Jameos del Agua, you could bring your own picnic. Things have changed a great deal since then, of course. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Yes, it wasn't really a direct question. I just wanted to hear your comments. I think there are pros and cons. It's a little risky. The centers here receive almost 3 million visitors a year. This creates a lot of jobs, and they're local jobs. They're not multinational hotels that are generating wealth. This is something where the whole island benefits from. In Gran Canaria, for instance, in comparison, there are only 500,000 visitors to the museums there. Whereas here, it's more comparable with the Alhambra, for instance, which is the most visited monument in Spain. What we need to do is to diversify our economy, however. There shouldn't be an over-reliance in tourism. We need to boost the economy and generate social benefits. But if this project is just interested in getting profits for international organizations, then I don't support it at all. So I've always had this question in my mind. What would Cesar's next project have been if he'd carried on working on the island? Well, Cesar and Soto and the other artists. Yes, well, in El Golfo, he had a half-finished project. From 1985, Cesar Manrique actually changed his attitude because tourist numbers had grown so much. In the cactus garden, he had further projects. He also wanted to extend the Jameos del Agua, but in the end he passed away before being able to complete any of these. He wasn't a meticulous planner. He wasn't even an architect. He turned up and changed ideas as he went along. So we have drawings of his projects, but we have no guarantee that that's actually what would have been built in the end. He may have changed his designs a great deal. In most of his works, he's made lots of changes to the structure as he went along. Good afternoon, Mario. I think it's also interesting to talk about the influence that Cesar Manrique had on the establishment of tourism here. His social influence, something that lasts even today. His conversations with the farmers, how he transmitted this love for the landscape. I think this is something interesting to highlight. I think it's something you can often appreciate better from the outside. But he really tried to transmit this message, this ideology. He was a social activist from the 80s, as you said. And I think this has been as impactful as his very first projects. Beyond his actual physical achievements, the monuments, the sculptures, etc., I think this social element is more important. Yes, as I said, he wasn't a mere painter. His influence goes much further beyond that. He helped to create this formula for development. He was a real pioneer, in fact, in the 1967. He helped to promote these rules for buildings not to be painted in any other color but white. And this was something very, very pioneering, as I said. In the ecological sector, he was also very active. In 1998, actually, there was talk of a moratorium on tourism building to stop tourist construction. And he was the trendsetter for all of these things, trying to always look for this socioeconomic balance, trying to always protect the culture despite the tourist development. He was key in this huge change from the images that you've seen in the 50s to suddenly a tourism destination with people from 90 different nationalities. It was a total transformation. And his direct contact with the people as a media was absolutely vital. We remember his funeral. It was absolutely, the roads were full of people wanting to show their respects as the funerary car passed by. And he's still quite a controversial local figure, in fact. Any more questions? Yes? Okay, well, thank you for your attention. I hope I've at least given you some clues to the past of Lanzarote. Thank you very much, Mario Ferrer. So, to bring this first day to a close, then, we will continue with our visits tomorrow. Thank you very much for your attention.